I'm Rebecca Garrett Pace.
I'm Mitchell Boone, and you're listening to The Day After Sunday,
A brief but nerdy conversation about yesterday's worship at White Rock United Methodist Church.
We talk about what caught our attention, stories we forgot to tell, and ways that we saw the Holy Spirit moving among us. Good morning, Rebecca.
Good morning, Mitchell. How are you?
I'm good. Yeah, things are good.
Someone commented on our very stylized "Good morning." Like it sounds like a
What'd they
news
say?
anchor show.
Yeah. Have you watched do you have Apple TV?
Uh-uh.
A morning show?
Mm-mm.
It was like their big push to break into the market and like compete with Hulu and Netflix and stuff.
Oh, okay.
Wasn't that
It didn't
No,
work.
it had Steve Carell, Jennifer Aniston, who else? I don't know. Whatever. It had a bunch of big names that dumped a lot of money into it, and I don't know. Unimpressed. What'd you do last night?
Not much. What about you? Oh, you said that so that you could take a drink of water.
No, I was really curious. What I did? Watched West Wing.
Nice.
Almost done. We're in season 7, so we're really pushing.
Whoa. Holy cow. You know, I restarted it after you said you were restarting it. I was like, okay, that's a good idea. I love the show, but I can't watch it in large chunks because I'm like, I don't really want to dive into politics right now.
Yeah. So you get it like an episode at a time.
Yeah. I'll do an episode, maybe 2, and then I'm like, I'm done with that for now. I need to go read.
Right.
Take a walk.
Go take a walk. Well, speaking of reading and taking walks, I am missing the fact that like so many things can't go on as normal, but I've been really impressed with what we've been doing here at the church, and I liked yesterday's worship service again, and I'm thinking that like we're kind of hitting our rhythm here.
Yeah, and it was like nice to be back in the parlor because even as much as the sanctuary is beautiful, it feels easier to do a more conversational worship service like in a smaller space.
Yeah, and it's just it's just a little more intimate.
Yeah.
It's kind of slower. It kind of slows things down a little bit. I don't know, that the sanctuary just carries this sort of like energy with it that just kind of like formalizes everything and kind of speeds up our rhythm a little bit. I think like things are a bit slower in the parlor.
That's interesting. Yeah, I hadn't thought of it in terms of like speed of energy.
Speed, but yeah. I just think like we're like, I don't know, we just walk with a little more purpose when we're in the sanctuary. I think it's just naturally like what spaces like that do. You know, I think they like,
oh yeah,
you know, like you kind of walk into a space and you're like, ooh, this is a different space. Like it kind of speeds us up a little bit. If we're, you know, obviously we have to be more mindful and we can actually slow down in those spaces and really soak it in. But I feel like the sanctuary, I'm just always like get a little like 1.5 speed on my steps and a little
that's
more
interesting. I think I kind of have the opposite reaction. I think that like I have a big Theology of Space, which shout out, as we're going to start our White Rock UMC blog sometime soon, as yet unnamed. So if you have any genius ideas for how to name it, please shoot me an email because I'm struggling. But one of the things that I want to talk about is the Theology of Space and how different spaces that we worship in, that we sing in, that we study in have really profound impacts on the way we put thoughts together, the way we move, you know, the speed that we think, all that kind of stuff. So that's really cool.
Yeah, maybe it's because, I don't know, I wouldn't say that every sanctuary does that. Maybe it's just, you know, the professional kind of aspect of my job and the relationship my job has to that space is, you know, different. And it just, but anyway, I just feel a little more relaxed, a little slower, a little more conscious in the parlor. Obviously, I have nothing to compare this to. I mean, truth is, like, I don't know what it'd be like if we tried to cram a bunch of people in the parlor and have worship in there every Sunday. But, but I have really enjoyed both spaces, and it's nice to be back in the parlor. It was nice to kind of get on the other side of Easter. Lent was starting to wear me down. You know, just theologically, it was heavy for what we're doing and the time, kind of the season that we're in. And so I'm looking forward to this lighter, kind of peppier worship series.
Yeah, and I think this is reflected in the rest of society too for us is, for example, I was talking to a friend of mine whose birthday was last week,
Oh,
and she was able to celebrate like with a socially distanced, very tiny group of friends that just came by her house and, stood 30 feet apart and just like chatted for a few minutes. And my birthday was the first week of the shelter in place.
yeah.
And so I was just comparing and contrasting that. Like, my birthday really was when everybody was in the thick of anxiety and fear, and
Sure.
now we're starting to find our stride. And I think it's the same for the way we're worshiping. Is we do have a little bit of a routine, um, and it's easier to find the normalcy, even though it's not
Right.
normal.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah. And we're kind of just realizing like we're not coming back for a while,
Right.
you which
Well, but yesterday
yeah.
we did start this Eastertide worship series, which is not really a series for us. We're just kind of following the lectionary texts.
Mhm.
Um, so, I mean, I know you chose all of your texts and sent those out via email. They're mostly gospel texts. We started yesterday in the Gospel of John, right?
Yeah, we're in the Gospel of John, then we're in the Gospel of Luke next week with the Emmaus story. Then we bounce around John a couple times. We're in John 10, John 14. This is more like foreshadowing Jesus kind of giving instruction to his disciples on how to live once he's gone. And then we're in Ephesians and First Peter, and then we're in the book of Acts for Pentecost. So I mean,
Yeah.
it's kind of as all over the place. It's not really going to be in any sort of you know linear fashion. It's really how do we take the Easter story? How do we apply it? How do we think about it in terms of what's happening right now in the world? And how do we think of it in terms of our faith? And can we become Easter people here and now? And so it's not a really tight worship series, but it is certainly tight in terms of the church has been having a season of Easter for a very long time. So like these are themes that are common, I think, within churches, and really this space between Easter and Pentecost. I'm
Yeah,
really
and
grateful.
I think too, I was reflecting on this while you were preaching, and I have many times in the past as well. What does the empty tomb really mean for us? And that made me think. Some person who was smarter than I am, yeah, I can't remember if it was a professor or an author, asked one time, what would it be like if our like the sign of our faith,
Right.
instead of being a cross, was an empty tomb?
Yeah.
Um,
Yep.
and
Instead of a
that's
crucifix, you have a empty tomb, right? Yeah.
exactly, instead of a crucifix around your neck, you have an empty tomb.
Right.
That's just fascinating to think about, and a lot harder to depict when you know what it is. It's real
Exactly.
it's real easy for non-artists to draw a cross
Draw
and you don't know
across.
what it is.
Uh,
Yeah.
what is that? It's an empty tomb.
It looks like a donut. Like
Yeah, right. Like yeah, I don't even know what looks like an empty tomb, but I guarantee you if I drew one, it
it
would
would not.
well,
Yeah.
I don't know. No, I'm not gonna try. Yeah, I think like that identity as Easter people
Yeah.
is really wrapped up in meditating on the empty tomb. I think we think the empty tomb is like really great on Easter morning, and we kind of reference it, and then we kind of forget about it. And the tomb remains empty, right? Well, Jesus doesn't return to the tomb. Jesus ascends into heaven on Ascension Sunday. That's where we celebrate that, and so the tomb is forever empty,
Right.
and that I think it really draws us into the larger question: what does it mean that Jesus rose from the dead for my life? Like not in theory, not theologically so much as to say like what does it mean for me as I like wake up today that
Yeah.
God has created this empty space. And I think especially in the midst of this pandemic it's kind of a big deal to ponder. But
Well, and I think yesterday's gospel text brought us into an interesting space where Jesus comes to visit his disciples and, teleports through a door,
Houdini's
and
himself is like, I think I referenced that in my
yeah,
sermon.
I love that. But so Lisa Hancock, who's a member of our congregation and excellent writer, she's working on her
He's
PhD.
brilliant.
And she actually wrote a blog post about this text, and it was really an interesting take on it. And I think we can try to find a way to
Yeah, I'll
link
put
it
it
here
in the
so you
show
can read
notes.
it. Yeah.
Yeah.
But she reflects on what does this story of what we call doubting Thomas, but we'll get there in a second. What does the story of Jesus coming to see his disciples say to us about being quarantined? And the points that she brought forward, some of them anyway, were talking about Jesus never shames the disciples for being in a closed room, not once, but twice, 2 weeks apart. He never says, like, what are y'all still doing here? You need to get back to work. You need to get back to business.
Right.
He meets them where they are. And it's almost like he recognizes that ministry and healing sometimes need to be in closed doors to protect others, to protect
Right.
yourselves.
Right.
Like
Right.
it's a
Right.
very dangerous time for the disciples then. So
Definitely.
I loved that. I want to continue to reflect on what this means for us. Not that we can also always draw a direct line from the scripture to our current life. I think we run the risk of twisting scriptures if we do that, too often. But I
Mhm.
think placing ourselves imaginatively in the stories is an incredibly helpful posture to say, you know, what does it mean? And Lisa's research in disability theology, too. What does it mean for us to stay behind closed doors and receive Jesus into our midst in order to protect ourselves and the vulnerable bodies among us?
Yeah. Ooh, that's good. That's really good stuff. I wonder, historically, and this was kind of the approach I took in my sermon, is historically, like, Thomas is nowhere to be found. We don't really know
Right.
why, and
Yeah. Where was
where
Thomas?
where Thomas is. We only get you don't really get a whole like bio of the disciples from the Gospels perspective,
Yeah.
right? Like you get little tidbits of who they are, their personalities, unless you're Peter or the beloved disciple in the Gospel of John. You really don't. We don't spend a lot of time like highlighting them or profiling them, so we don't really know what Thomas is doing. The assumption is that Thomas is just kind of living his life. He'd already kind of come to grips with this notion of death, and was kind of just out in the world. It is fascinating to get back to Lisa's point. What it must have been like to be the disciples, worried about their own safety,
Mm-hmm.
and worried about not only their own safety but probably the safety of all the folks they love too,
Mm-hmm.
right? So like it does in some ways mirror what we're doing here. Like Cash and my Eli, we haven't been over to my parents' house, and it's because we want to keep them safe.
Yep.
The disciples had family and people that they loved, right? And so not going back to those spaces too is
Mm-hmm.
really critical in terms of, or at least they thought it was critical because they were worried about what happens. And they'd seen the Roman government work, and they've seen
Right.
what it looked like for the authorities to like chase down people and really bring them to justice, so to speak, for, in terms of how they understood, disruption and revolution. But yeah, so you have these disciples who are in locked quarters, protecting not only themselves but the people that they love. And I think that that's a generous reading of what's happening there, but I think it's a good reading and an accurate reading, especially as we read it in the midst of our own sheltering in place.
Yeah. Yeah, and the another thing that came forward to me was this whole notion, and I know Phil Dickey talked about this too. It's such a powerful thing to hear and to be reminded as often as we can that words are powerful, right?
Right.
Words
Yep.
matter.
Words
The titles that we give each other
yeah.
matter, and that made me think of, because I was an education major in college, music education, and that made me think of person first language, which I
Right.
know is not just in the education field, but it's
Right.
especially big in education and nonprofit world.
Mm-hmm.
This notion that the person has adjectives that may describe them, but they are not defined by them, right? It's the
Right.
difference is huge between saying,
Exactly.
a student with autism versus,
Autistic student.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. What would have meant, what does it look like for us to say like Thomas who is doubting
right.
versus doubting Thomas, or Thomas the doubter? I think that you're right, like the labels we use and the more we use them, the more they kind of get ingrained and they begin to define folks for us. Not,
Right.
And I think City Square does a really good job about this. They use neighbor first language, so everyone's neighbor,
Mm-hmm.
and then depending on what kind of situation our neighbors are in, then they can help describe. But it's always neighbor first. And
Like, give me some
so
examples of that.
like
Like, how
so
does City Square do that?
yeah, so it's it's not a homeless person,
Mm-hmm.
it's a neighbor experiencing homelessness.
Mm-hmm.
So they reframe everything around neighbor first, so that you connect the person to your understanding of community,
Yep.
and then you connect that person that's in your community to something that is happening to them, and it brings the person to the forefront instead of putting them in the background.
Right.
You don't see someone experiencing homelessness as a homeless individual. You see them as a person first, and then a reality second. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that we don't do a good job of that in our lives, in really anywhere. But we can get better at it. I think we can also get better at it if we take this, and it's a brilliant idea, Rebecca, to take this and like then apply it to like how we understand characters in scripture.
Mm-hmm.
So like and then scripture is really bad. Like
Yeah.
historically we've read scripture really poorly. Everyone is defined by their deficiency really in scripture. So you
Mm-hmm.
have like the leper, or you have
The blind
the
man.
blind man, or the person the demonic, right? I mean, like everyone is like, what's wrong with them first, and then so in some ways, like it would be really interesting, and I haven't done a lot on this, but how does Jesus restore first person language? How does Jesus like bring the person to the forefront, and what they're dealing with is in the background?
Mm-hmm.
Be really fascinating. But we should do it with Thomas, because to do it with Thomas then allows us to actually help reclaim Thomas as a central figure to what it means to have faith and believe in Jesus.
Right. And the Tillich quote that you brought forward, right, is
Right.
that doubt and faith are not opposites. Doubt and faith go hand in hand. Certainty is the opposite of faith.
Yeah, and it kind of gets to what Paul said, right? Like
Yeah.
Paul talks about we hope for things unseen.
Mm-hmm.
It's Paul's talking about something different, but it's this notion that you can't hope for things that you know exist, right? Like you can't hope for things that are tangible. You can't have faith in something that you are certain of. To want certainty is to not want to participate in faith. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that that's just a really rich text, because we are rich quote, because I think we're addicted to certainty.
Sure.
I
Yeah.
mean, in a world that's unknown, and
Yeah.
in this postmodern world, kind of post-truth world, uh, it feels so uncertain that we become, I think, even more kind of pushed and motivated by certainty in certain aspects of our lives. And I think that that's a challenge to our faith, because we want things to be provable,
Mm.
and we want things to be foundational and tactile and tangible, and
We
God's
want things to
not
be
that
credible, right?
credible, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Not There's nothing credible about the resurrection.
Right. Yeah, I loved that when you drew that word out. Because I mean, I'm a word nerd in general, but when you said the real meaning of incredible, it is not credible
Not credible.
at
Yeah.
all.
Yeah. So, and that is that's the hard part about our journey, and
Right.
what we believe and where we're headed. So it
And
was
we
a
can get
really good
into a
Sunday.
larger conversation about truth versus fact then,
Yeah,
you know?
I love that stuff, and
Yeah.
I really think that that's a propellant or an accelerant in the conversation around how do we kind of reclaim this evangelical Christianity. How do we like bring it back
Hmm.
from some of this like dangerous and damaging ways it's been used and followed. I think this conversation around fact and truth is really good.
Hmm.
So
And it's not limited to evangelical Christianity either.
no, definitely.
It's
But I
driven, I mean, I think in as much part, I was thinking about this the other day, it's driven just as much maybe because we are in a secular society
Sure.
that's driven toward success and profit, right? I mean, it's this
Sure.
Enneagram 3 performance drive that we have to know, we have to do, we have to be everything that we see as the ideal.
Yeah. I mean, you could make an argument that this fact truth thing, all right, so it starts at the scientific revolution, and you kind of like in the developing of method and theory and testing all that. And then really the evangelical kind of adoption of fact versus truth, or fact over truth, is really just in response to that. So it's this game that we keep playing, is like, well, I need to be able to prove this so others will believe me, or I can sleep at night and believe myself, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or and I think we just get into a place where, like, before we know it, we're 150 years into this experiment, and we're so addicted to truth, being factual, that we've kind of lost the ability to be creative and think broadly, and really use our imaginations in our faith. And then we kind of feel guilty when we can't verify things the way
Mm-hmm.
that the world expects us to verify. And so instead of like leaning into it, we kind of lean back. And that's, I think, where our faith gets kind of shaky, is we don't know what to do with this fact truth kind of dichotomy. And it's certainly propelled by wanting to project a certain image, as you said,
Mm-hmm.
of wanting to seem like we know what we're talking about, or we know what we're saying, or our faith can be, something that's public. And the
Mm.
more public we make our faith, the more we're kind of, I don't know. It really compounds in on
It's
itself.
rich. Yeah, it sounds like something we should dive into in Tiny Desk Theology.
Ooh, yeah, I like that.
Yeah,
All right, I'll put
because
it
that
down on
starts
the list.
tonight, right?
Tiny Desk Theology starts tonight at 8 p.m. We're going to be talking about evil and God and theodicy. So
Just small little stuff to get
small
us
little
started.
things. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So, but yeah, I hope to see y'all tonight for that. And Rebecca, it was a good Sunday. Good
Yeah, it was
pod.
great.
Sounds like it was a good pod. Go back and listen to it. We'll see y'all next week.
Take care.
You're listening to a podcast recorded at White Rock United Methodist Church in the heart of East Dallas. For more information, you can find us at wrumc.org. And make sure you stay subscribed to this channel to stay up to date with all of our content.